There are moments in life when everything you believed about trust, about loyalty, about the people closest to you, shatters like glass dropped from a great height. The sound of that breaking stays with you forever. It echoes in the quiet moments, in the spaces between sleep and waking, in the hollow feeling that takes root in your chest and refuses to leave. I know that sound intimately now. I know it because I lived through something that fundamentally changed who I am, something that taught me the true meaning of betrayal and the cold, calculated patience required to deliver justice when the world refuses to do it for you. My name is Marcus Ellington. I am 34 years old, and I work as a senior software architect at one of the largest financial technology companies in Chicago. Or rather, I should say that I did work there, in that specific role, until the events I am about to share with you unfolded and changed everything. What I am going to tell you is not a story about simple office politics or petty workplace drama. This is a confession about how someone I trusted, someone I mentored and protected and helped rise through the ranks, systematically stole everything I had built over 4 years and nearly destroyed my career, my reputation, and my sense of self. This is also the story of how I fought back. I want you to understand something from the very beginning. I am not a vindictive person by nature. I grew up in a modest household on the south side of Chicago, raised by a single mother who worked double shifts as a nurse to put me through school. She taught me that hard work was the only honest currency in this world, that integrity meant more than any paycheck, and that treating people with respect was non-negotiable regardless of how they treated you. I carried those values with me through college, through graduate school, through the early years of my career when I was grinding away at entry-level positions for companies that barely noticed I existed. I built everything I had brick by brick, sacrifice by sacrifice, late night by late night. So when I tell you that the betrayal I experienced pushed me to my absolute limit, I need you to understand that I did not arrive at revenge easily. I was driven there, step by painful step, by someone who mistook my kindness for weakness and my patience for stupidity. His name was Derek Holloway. When I first met him, he was 26 years old, fresh out of a coding boot camp, and so eager to prove himself that he practically vibrated with nervous energy. He had been hired as a junior developer on my team at FinTech Solutions International, the company where I had worked my way up over the course of 7 years to become one of the lead architects on our flagship product. Derek was assigned to me directly, which meant I was responsible for his training, his development, and ultimately his success or failure within the organization. I remember the first day he walked into my office. He was tall, lanky, with the kind of earnest face that made you want to help him. He had sandy brown hair that always looked slightly disheveled, no matter how hard he tried to tame it, and these bright blue eyes that seemed to take in everything around him with an almost childlike curiosity. He shook my hand firmly, maybe too firmly, and said that he had heard great things about me, that he felt incredibly lucky to be learning from someone with my reputation. At the time, I took the compliment at face value. I had no reason not to. Looking back now, I can see the first flicker of something else in those blue eyes. Ambition, yes, but also calculation. A quiet hunger that I mistook for determination. Over the next 3 years, I invested more time and energy into Derek's development than I had invested in any other mentee in my entire career. I taught him everything I knew about system architecture, about elegant code design, about navigating the political complexities of a large organization. When he struggled with imposter syndrome, I was the one who talked him through it, who reminded him of his accomplishments, who advocated for him in meetings where his contributions might otherwise have gone unnoticed. When his girlfriend broke up with him during his 2nd year at the company, I was the one who covered his work for 2 weeks so he could take time to recover without damaging his professional standing. When he needed a reference for a mortgage application, I wrote him a glowing letter that helped him secure his first home. I did all of this gladly, without expectation of anything in return, because I believed that lifting others up was part of my responsibility as a leader. The project that would eventually become the vehicle for my destruction began in the spring of my 4th year at the company. Our CEO, a sharp-minded woman named Patricia Chen, announced that we would be developing a revolutionary new payment processing system that would position us as the industry leader in real-time cross-border transactions. It was an enormously ambitious undertaking, the kind of project that could make or break careers. When the executive team began assembling the core development group, I was chosen to lead the architectural design. It was the biggest opportunity of my professional life, and I was determined to make it count. I worked on that project for 18 months. 18 months of 100-hour weeks, of canceled vacations, of missed birthdays and holidays, and all the small moments that make up a life outside of work. My girlfriend at the time, a wonderful woman named Jasmine, eventually left me because I could not seem to tear myself away from my laptop long enough to maintain our relationship. I barely noticed when she packed her things and walked out the door. I was too consumed by the vision I was building, the elegant system that would process millions of transactions per second while maintaining perfect security and regulatory compliance. I poured everything I had into that project, every ounce of creativity and technical knowledge I had accumulated over more than a decade in the industry. I documented everything meticulously, created detailed design specifications, developed innovative algorithms that solved problems no one else in the industry had managed to crack. It was, without exaggeration, my life's work. Derek was on the project team, of course. By then, he had been promoted twice on my recommendation, and he was serving as one of my senior developers. I trusted him implicitly. I shared everything with him, not just because he was part of the team, but because I genuinely believed he was my friend. We had lunch together most days. We grabbed beers after particularly brutal work sessions. I knew about his family troubles, his career anxieties, his dreams of eventually starting his own company. He knew about my mother's declining health, my regrets about Jasmine, my fears that I was sacrificing too much of my life for a corporation that would forget me the moment I became inconvenient. We were close, at least I thought we were. The first sign that something was wrong came about 14 months into the project. I had been working on a particularly complex component of the system, a real-time fraud detection algorithm that used machine learning to identify suspicious transaction patterns. It was cutting-edge work, the kind of thing that could have generated patents and industry recognition. I had been developing it quietly, not because I was secretive by nature, but because I wanted to present it as a complete solution rather than an incomplete concept that might be shot down by the risk-averse executives who controlled our budget. I had shared early versions of the algorithm with Derek, asking for his input on certain implementation details, and he had been enthusiastic in his support. Then one morning, I walked into a meeting of the senior leadership team and watched in confusion as our chief technology officer, a man named Richard Brennan, began presenting a fraud detection approach that sounded remarkably familiar. The terminology was different. The slides were polished in a way mine never were. But the underlying architecture was unmistakably my work. I sat there frozen, trying to process what I was seeing, as Richard credited the innovation to a member of his direct team who had apparently been developing it independently for the past several months. That member was Derek Holloway. I want to be honest about what I felt in that moment. It was not anger. Not at first. It was confusion, deep and disorienting. Like waking up in a room you do not recognize. Surely there had been some mistake. Surely Derek had presented my work as a collaborative effort and the credit had simply been misattributed by a CTO who did not understand the nuances of our team dynamics. There had to be an explanation. Derek would never steal from me. We were friends. I had helped him build his entire career. I caught Derek in the hallway after the meeting, my heart pounding with a mixture of anxiety and desperate hope that this was all a misunderstanding. I asked him about the presentation, trying to keep my voice casual, trying not to reveal the storm of emotions churning beneath my calm exterior. Derek looked at me with those blue eyes, and for the first time, I saw something cold in them, something that had probably always been there, but that I had been too trusting to notice. He told me that he had been working on fraud detection approaches for months, that any similarities between his work and mine were purely coincidental, that he was surprised I would try to claim credit for something he had developed independently. He said it with such confidence, such practiced sincerity, that for a brief moment I actually questioned my own memory. Had I imagined sharing those documents with him? Had I somehow confused his work with mine? But no, I knew what I had created. I knew the hours I had spent, the problems I had solved, the elegant solutions I had crafted. This was my work, and Derek was standing in front of me and lying to my face. I did not confront him further in that moment. Looking back, I wish I had pushed harder, demanded answers, forced the issue right then and there, but I was still operating under the assumption that there was some rational explanation, that this situation could be resolved through normal professional channels. I told myself that I would speak to Richard directly, show him my documentation, explain the timeline of my development work. The truth would come out, and Derek would have to admit what he had done, and we would move past this unfortunate incident. I was naive. I had no idea what I was actually dealing with. The meeting with Richard did not go the way I expected. I brought my documentation, my version control logs, my design notes with timestamps stretching back months before Derek had supposedly begun his independent work. Richard listened politely, his expression unreadable, and then he told me something that made my blood run cold. Derek had already spoken to him. Derek had warned him that I might try to claim credit for his innovations, that I had been struggling with the pressure of the project and had developed a concerning pattern of trying to take ownership of other people's contributions. Richard did not say this accusingly, but there was a new distance in his eyes, a wariness that had not been there before. I felt like the ground was opening beneath my feet. This was not just theft. This was a coordinated attack on my reputation, a preemptive strike designed to discredit me before I could even mount a defense. Derek had not just stolen my work. He had poisoned the well, made sure that any attempt to reclaim what was rightfully mine would look like the desperate ravings of a jealous colleague. The sophistication of it stunned me. The person I had trusted, had mentored, had treated like a younger brother, had been planning this for months, maybe longer. I went home that night and could not sleep. I lay in my empty apartment, staring at the ceiling, replaying every interaction I had ever had with Derek through this new lens. The eager handshake on his first day, the grateful tears when I covered for him after his breakup, the long conversations about our hopes and fears, conversations that I now realized had been one-sided. He had been gathering information while I had been building a friendship. I was a resource to him, nothing more. A stepping stone on his path to something greater. The following weeks were a slow-motion nightmare. Derek's fraud detection system received praise from the executive team. He was invited to present at an industry conference. His name appeared in internal communications celebrating the innovation happening within our organization. Meanwhile, my documentation, my timestamps, my evidence of original authorship sat in folders on my computer, growing more irrelevant with each passing day. In the court of corporate opinion, Derek had already won. He had established the narrative, and changing a narrative once it has taken hold is nearly impossible. I made one more attempt to address the situation through official channels. I scheduled a meeting with our human resources department, specifically with a woman named Carolyn Winters, who handled employee relations issues. I laid out my case methodically, presenting the timeline of my work, the documented evidence of Derek's access to my files, the statistical improbability that two people working in the same organization could independently develop nearly identical solutions to the same problem. Carolyn listened attentively, took notes, and promised to investigate. 2 weeks later, I was called into a meeting with Carolyn, Richard, and a representative from our legal department. They informed me that their investigation had found no evidence of intellectual property theft. Derek's version control logs showed a consistent pattern of development work stretching back months. His colleagues on other projects vouched for his technical capabilities. Several people reported that I had been behaving erratically in recent weeks, making accusations without foundation, attempting to undermine a rising star in the organization. The meeting ended with a formal warning about my conduct and a strong suggestion that I focus on my own work rather than concerning myself with the accomplishments of others. I sat in my car in the parking garage for an hour after that meeting, unable to move, unable to think. They had not just dismissed my complaint, they had turned it against me, transformed me from a victim into a troublemaker. And the cruelest part, the part that kept me awake for nights afterward, was that I could see exactly how Derek had done it. The version control logs he had presented were fabrications, cleverly backdated entries that created a false paper trail of independent development. The colleagues who vouched for him were people he had cultivated relationships with, people who owed him favors or who simply liked him better than they liked me. The reports of my erratic behavior were exaggerations of normal workplace stress, twisted into a narrative of instability. Every piece of his defense had been carefully constructed over months, a masterwork of deception that I had been too trusting to notice being built. For a few weeks after that meeting, I considered giving up. Not just giving up the fight over the fraud detection algorithm, but giving up on my career entirely. What was the point of working so hard, of sacrificing so much, if someone could simply steal everything you built and face no consequences? The system was broken. The people in power either could not see the truth or did not care. I started looking at job listings in other cities, fantasizing about disappearing into a completely different career where none of this would matter. But then something happened that changed everything. I was cleaning out my desk drawers, half-heartedly preparing for a departure I had not yet decided to make, when I found a birthday card Derek had given me 2 years earlier. It was a simple card, nothing special. But inside, he had written a note thanking me for being his mentor, his friend, his inspiration. He had signed it with a little drawing of us standing next to a computer, stick figures with disproportionately large smiles. I stared at that card for a long time, and something shifted inside me. The grief and confusion that had been paralyzing me began to crystallize into something else, something colder, something patient. I was not going to run away. I was not going to let Derek Holloway destroy everything I had worked for while I disappeared into obscurity. I was going to fight back, but I was going to do it intelligently. I was going to be methodical. I was going to gather evidence. I was going to wait for the right moment. And when that moment came, I was going to expose him for exactly what he was. The first step in my plan was to become invisible. I needed Derek to believe that he had won, that I had been sufficiently beaten down by the HR process to stop causing problems. So I changed my behavior completely. I stopped talking about the fraud detection system. I stopped mentioning Derek's name in meetings. I threw myself into my work with renewed focus, volunteering for every project, meeting every deadline, being the model employee that I had always been before this nightmare began. Slowly, the wariness in my colleagues' eyes began to fade. The narrative of Marcus the troublemaker was replaced by the narrative of Marcus the dedicated professional who had moved past an unfortunate misunderstanding. Derek, for his part, seemed to interpret my silence as surrender. He became more confident, more visible, more willing to position himself as a rising leader within the organization. He started attending executive meetings, networking with senior leadership, dropping hints about his interest in management positions. His career was accelerating exactly as he had planned, built on the foundation of work that I had done. Watching it happen was agonizing, but I kept my expression neutral, my demeanor pleasant, my true feelings buried deep where no one could see them. While I was performing the role of the reformed employee, I was also conducting a careful, methodical investigation. I needed evidence, real evidence, not the circumstantial documentation that HR had so easily dismissed. I started paying attention to Derek in ways I never had before, noting his habits, his relationships, his patterns of behavior. I observed which colleagues he was closest to, which executives he was cultivating, which projects he was most interested in. I looked for weaknesses, inconsistencies, anything that might reveal the truth of who he really was beneath the charming exterior. The first crack in his facade appeared about 3 months into my quiet investigation. I was working late one evening, as I often did, when I overheard a conversation between Derek and another developer named Brian Chen. They were in a conference room down the hall, and they clearly did not realize anyone else was still in the office. I could not hear every word, but I caught enough to understand the gist. Brian was uncomfortable about something. He kept saying that it did not feel right, that they should have done it differently. Derek's response was dismissive, almost contemptuous. He said something about how Brian needed to stop worrying, that no one was ever going to find out, that they were already past the point where it mattered. I did not know what they were talking about specifically, but the tone of the conversation told me everything I needed to know. Derek had other secrets beyond the theft of my work. He had other collaborators, other schemes, other lies. If I could uncover them, I might be able to build a case that even HR could not ignore. Over the following weeks, I cultivated a careful friendship with Brian Chen. I was subtle about it, never pushing too hard, never asking direct questions about Derek. Instead, I positioned myself as a sympathetic ear, someone who understood the pressures of working on high-profile projects, someone who had been through difficult situations himself. Brian was a naturally nervous person, the kind who needed to talk through his anxieties with someone else. All I had to do was be available and patient, and eventually he would tell me what I needed to know. It took almost 2 months, but finally, during a late-night coding session when we were both exhausted and Brian's usual defenses were down, he let something slip. He mentioned that Derek had asked him to adjust some version control logs a while back, that it had seemed like a minor thing at the time, but that it had been bothering him ever since. I kept my expression neutral, asked gentle follow-up questions without seeming too interested, and gradually extracted the full story. Brian had helped Derek backdate several months of development work, creating the false paper trail that had been used to establish Derek's supposed independent creation of the fraud detection algorithm. Brian had been told that it was just a formality, that Derek had actually done the work but had forgotten to log it properly, that they were just correcting an administrative oversight. By the time Brian realized the full scope of what he had participated in, it was too late. He was complicit, and he knew that coming forward would destroy his own career along with Derek's. This was the breakthrough I had been waiting for. I had a witness, someone who could corroborate my claims about the fabricated evidence. But I also knew that Brian's testimony alone would not be enough. He was terrified of the consequences of coming forward, and Derek would simply claim that Brian was lying to save his own skin. I needed more. I started digging deeper into Derek's background, looking for patterns of behavior that might reveal a history of deception. I researched his previous employers, his educational history, his professional associations. What I found was illuminating. Derek had left his position before joining our company under circumstances that were vaguely described as mutual agreement between him and his employer. I reached out to a contact at that company, someone I had met at an industry conference years earlier, and asked casually about Derek's reputation. My contact hesitated, clearly uncomfortable, but eventually admitted that Derek had been asked to leave after several colleagues raised concerns about his tendency to take credit for collaborative work. No formal action had been taken, but the pattern was clear. Derek had done this before. I was not his first victim. Armed with this new information, I began to see the full picture of who Derek Holloway really was. He was not just opportunistic. He was a serial intellectual property thief, a skilled manipulator who identified talented but trusting individuals, ingratiated himself with them, extracted their ideas and knowledge, and then positioned himself as the originator of their work. He had refined his technique over years, learning from each previous experience how to cover his tracks more effectively, how to preempt accusations, how to turn victims into villains. I was simply the latest in a long line of people he had exploited. This realization changed my approach. I was no longer just seeking justice for myself. I was trying to stop someone who would continue to victimize others if he was not exposed. The stakes were higher than my own career. Derek Holloway was a predator, and predators needed to be stopped. The next phase of my plan required me to catch Derek in the act. It was not enough to prove what he had done to me. I needed to document him doing it again, to someone else, in a way that would be undeniable. This meant identifying his next target and finding a way to observe his methods in real time. I did not have to wait long. A few months after I began my investigation, a new developer joined our team. Her name was Elena Rodriguez, and she was brilliant. She had come from academia, having completed a PhD in machine learning, and she was full of innovative ideas about how to improve our systems. She was also kind, trusting, and eager to fit in. In other words, she was exactly the type of person Derek preyed upon. I watched with mounting dread as Derek began his familiar dance. He offered to mentor Elena, to help her navigate the complexities of corporate culture, to advocate for her with senior leadership. He asked thoughtful questions about her research, praised her ideas effusively, positioned himself as her ally and protector. It was the same playbook he had used with me, executed with the same calculated charm. Elena was falling for it completely, grateful to have found such a supportive colleague in her first corporate role. I wanted to warn her. I wanted to pull her aside and tell her everything I knew about Derek, to save her from the betrayal that I knew was coming. But I also knew that approaching her directly would be a mistake. If I told Elena my suspicions without proof, she would probably think I was the problem, not Derek. He had already established himself as her trusted mentor. My warnings would sound like the ravings of a jealous colleague, exactly the narrative Derek had constructed about me. I needed to be smarter. Instead of warning Elena, I positioned myself as a quiet ally. I offered to collaborate with her on a small project, one that was unrelated to Derek's areas of focus. I made sure she knew that she could come to me with questions or concerns. I established trust slowly, carefully, without ever criticizing Derek or revealing my true agenda. If and when Derek betrayed her, I wanted to be someone she could turn to. Over the following months, I also began documenting everything. I installed screen recording software on my work computer, ostensibly for creating training videos. I saved copies of every document I created using a personal cloud storage system that could not be accessed or altered by anyone at the company. I kept detailed journals of my observations, noting dates, times, and specific behaviors. I was building a case, piece by piece, preparing for the moment when I would have enough evidence to expose Derek once and for all. The moment came about 8 months into Elena's tenure at the company. She had been working on an innovative approach to predictive analytics, something that could revolutionize how our products anticipated customer behavior. It was exactly the kind of groundbreaking work that Derek would want to claim for himself. I watched as he began asking more questions about her project, as he offered increasingly specific suggestions that seemed to mirror ideas she had shared with him in private conversations, as he positioned himself more prominently in meetings where her work was discussed. Then, one afternoon, I received a message from Elena asking if we could talk privately. Her tone was different from usual, more subdued, more uncertain. We met in a coffee shop far from the office, and she told me that something strange was happening. Derek had just presented a proposal to the executive team for a new predictive analytics initiative. His proposal contained ideas that sounded remarkably similar to concepts she had developed in her own research, concepts she had shared with him in confidence as she was refining her approach. She did not want to accuse him of anything, she said, but she could not shake the feeling that something was wrong. I let her talk, let her process her confusion and doubt, and then I asked if she would be willing to share her original documentation with me. She agreed, and what I saw confirmed my suspicions. Derek's proposal was built on the foundation of Elena's work, restructured and rephrased to obscure its origins but fundamentally derivative of her innovations. He was doing it again. He was doing to her exactly what he had done to me. This time, however, I was prepared. I had been documenting Derek's behavior for months. I had Brian's confession about the backdated version control logs. I had evidence of Derek's problematic history at his previous employer. I had Elena's original documentation proving that her ideas preceded Derek's proposal. And I had one more thing, something I had not even been looking for, but that had fallen into my lap through a stroke of extraordinary luck. About a month earlier, I had been going through some old email backups looking for documentation to support my case when I stumbled across something unexpected. It was an email from Derek to an address I did not recognize, sent shortly after the fraud detection controversy had died down. In the email, Derek was bragging about how he had handled me, how he had neutralized my complaints before they could become a problem, how the stupid HR people had bought his story without question. He was describing his methods in detail, apparently to someone he trusted, someone who shared his contempt for the people around him. The email was essentially a confession, preserved in writing, completely damning. I do not know why Derek had sent that email through his work account rather than a personal one. Perhaps he had made a mistake, perhaps he had been overconfident, perhaps he simply did not believe anyone would ever find it. Whatever the reason, I now had evidence in his own words admitting to the fabrication of documentation and the deliberate deception of HR. Combined with everything else I had gathered, it was more than enough. But I did not go to HR. Not yet. I had learned from my previous experience that the official channels were easily manipulated, that Derek would find ways to twist the narrative if I gave him the opportunity to mount a defense. Instead, I decided to take a different approach, one that would leave no room for doubt, no space for his lies to take root. I started by reaching out to Derek's previous employer, the one where he had left under suspicious circumstances. I spoke with the colleagues who had been victimized by him there. People who had never received justice and who had been waiting for years for someone to hold Derek accountable. I gathered their stories, their documentation, their evidence. The pattern that emerged was even more damning than I had imagined. Derek had been stealing intellectual property for almost a decade, jumping from company to company, leaving a trail of damaged careers and stolen innovations in his wake. He had never faced real consequences because each individual victim had been isolated, discredited, and silenced. No one had ever connected the dots, until now. I also reached out to industry journalists, specifically writers who covered corporate misconduct and intellectual property issues. I did not give them the full story right away. Instead, I offered tantalizing hints, enough to spark their interest without revealing my complete hand. Several journalists expressed interest in investigating further, especially when I mentioned that this was not an isolated incident, but part of a pattern spanning multiple companies over many years. The final piece of my plan involved Elena. I sat down with her and told her everything. I told her about what Derek had done to me, about the evidence I had gathered, about the victims at other companies who had similar stories. I told her that she was not crazy, that her suspicions were justified, that Derek was exactly what she feared he was. And I gave her a choice. She could let it go, stay silent, protect her career from the fallout that would inevitably come. Or she could stand with me, add her voice to the chorus of people Derek had victimized, and help bring him down once and for all. Elena did not hesitate. She was angry, righteously angry, at the betrayal of trust she had experienced. She was also terrified of the professional consequences, but she said that she could not live with herself if she let Derek continue to hurt other people. She was in. Together, we prepared our case. We organized the evidence chronologically, demonstrating the clear pattern of behavior across multiple companies and multiple victims. We prepared statements from everyone Derek had wronged, including Brian, who had finally agreed to come forward after learning the full extent of Derek's deceptions. We compiled everything into a comprehensive document that left no room for misinterpretation. Then, instead of going to HR, we went directly to the CEO. Patricia Chen was known for her no-nonsense approach to corporate governance. She had built her reputation on integrity and transparency, and she had zero tolerance for the kind of political manipulation that people like Derek relied upon. I requested a private meeting with her, explaining only that I had information of critical importance to the company that could not be shared through normal channels. She agreed to see me. I brought Elena with me. We sat across from Patricia in her corner office, the Chicago skyline spreading out behind her, and we told her everything. We presented our evidence. We explained how Derek had manipulated HR, how he had preemptively discredited victims before they could come forward, how he had been doing this for years across multiple organizations. We showed her the email where Derek had confessed in his own words. We gave her the contact information for his previous victims, for the journalists who were already investigating, for everyone who could corroborate our claims. Patricia listened in silence, her expression unreadable. When we finished, she thanked us for coming to her directly and promised that she would personally oversee the investigation. She said that if our allegations were true, Derek would face appropriate consequences. And then she said something that I will never forget. She apologized. She said that she was sorry the system had failed me, that the HR process had been manipulated by someone skilled at deception, that my concerns had been dismissed when they should have been taken seriously. It was a small thing, perhaps, but it meant more to me than I can adequately express. The investigation took several weeks, but the outcome was never really in doubt. The evidence was simply too overwhelming. Derek tried his usual tactics, attempting to discredit me and Elena, painting us as disgruntled employees with personal vendettas. But this time, there were too many voices, too many documented incidents, too clear a pattern for his lies to gain traction. The journalists I had contacted published a devastating exposé detailing Derek's years of intellectual property theft across multiple companies. Former colleagues from his previous employers came forward publicly, sharing their stories, corroborating our claims. Derek's carefully constructed reputation crumbled in a matter of days. The company terminated Derek's employment immediately, but that was only the beginning. The exposé attracted the attention of lawyers representing several technology companies who had been victimized by Derek's schemes over the years. Civil suits were filed, alleging fraud, breach of contract, and intellectual property theft. Derek's professional reputation was completely destroyed, his LinkedIn connections evaporating, his industry relationships severed. He became a cautionary tale, the subject of ethics seminars and cautionary articles about the importance of protecting intellectual property. I learned later that Derek had attempted to find work at several other companies, but his name had become toxic. Nobody would hire him. The career he had built on the stolen labor of others collapsed entirely, and there was nothing he could do to rebuild it. Every attempt to rehabilitate his image was met with a fresh wave of articles detailing his history of deception. He had become unhireable, a pariah in the industry he had once seemed destined to dominate. But the professional consequences were only part of Derek's downfall. Several months after the initial exposé, I received news that one of the civil suits had uncovered evidence of actual fraud, not just intellectual property theft, but misrepresentation of credentials and falsification of financial documents. The case was referred to federal prosecutors, and Derek was eventually charged with wire fraud and related offenses. He pleaded guilty to avoid a lengthy trial and was sentenced to 18 months in federal prison. I was not in the courtroom when the sentence was handed down, but I read about it in the newspaper the next morning. I sat at my kitchen table, drinking coffee, staring at the headline about the disgraced tech executive who had finally faced justice. I expected to feel triumphant, vindicated, satisfied. But what I actually felt was something more complicated. Relief, certainly. Closure to some extent. But also a strange emptiness, a recognition that I had spent more than 2 years of my life consumed by this mission, that I had sacrificed relationships, opportunities, and pieces of my own humanity in pursuit of justice. The revenge I had sought had been achieved, but it had not restored what I had lost. The time was gone. The trust was gone. A part of my faith in people had been permanently damaged. I want to be clear about something. I do not regret what I did. Derek Holloway was a predator who had victimized countless people over the course of his career. He needed to be stopped, and the official systems designed to stop people like him had failed repeatedly. Someone had to step up, had to be willing to do the difficult, methodical work of gathering evidence and building a case that could not be dismissed. I am proud that I was that person. I am proud that I helped give voice to the many victims who had been silenced, who had doubted themselves, who had wondered if they were crazy for believing that they had been wronged. I am proud that I protected people like Elena from experiencing the same devastation that Derek had inflicted on me. But I also learned something important about the nature of revenge during this process. It does not heal you. It does not make you whole. At best, it clears the obstacles that were preventing you from moving forward. The actual work of healing, of rebuilding trust, of rediscovering your sense of self after it has been shattered by betrayal, that work is separate from justice. It requires different skills, different commitments, different kinds of courage, and it takes much, much longer. In the years since Derek's conviction, I have done that work. I left the company where all of this happened, not because I was forced out, but because I needed a fresh start, a place without memories, a chance to rebuild my professional identity from scratch. I moved to Seattle, took a position at a smaller company where I could make a real difference, started seeing a therapist to process the emotional damage I had sustained. I reconnected with old friends I had neglected during my years of obsessive investigation. I slowly, painfully learned to trust again, to open up to new colleagues and new relationships without assuming that everyone was secretly plotting against me. I also stayed in touch with Elena, who had become a dear friend through our shared experience. She was promoted twice in the years after Derek's departure, her innovative work finally receiving the recognition it deserved. We talk regularly, comparing notes on our respective journeys, supporting each other through the ongoing challenges of careers in an industry where people like Derek still exist, still manipulate, still prey on the trusting and talented. We remind each other that we are not alone, that what happened to us was not our fault, that we did the right thing by fighting back. Brian Chen, the colleague who had helped Derek falsify the version control logs, also emerged from this experience changed. His cooperation in the investigation was taken into account, and he avoided serious professional consequences. But the guilt of what he had participated in weighed on him heavily. He eventually left the technology industry entirely, went back to school to become a counselor, and now works with young professionals on recognizing and resisting workplace manipulation. In a strange way, his complicity in Derek's schemes led him to a more meaningful path than he might otherwise have found. As for me, I am doing well. I am doing better than I ever imagined possible during those dark months when it seemed like Derek had won, when it seemed like the truth would never come out, when I questioned whether there was any point in continuing to fight. I am a different person than I was before all of this happened. I am more cautious, yes, but also more resilient. I am less trusting by default, but more discerning about who deserves my trust. I understand now that the world contains both extraordinary kindness and profound cruelty, often in the same institutions, sometimes in the same individuals. I have seen the worst of what people are capable of, but I have also seen the best. I have seen courage, solidarity, truth ultimately prevailing over lies. There is one more thing I want to share with you, something that happened just a few months ago. I was at an industry conference in San Francisco presenting some of my recent work on secure payment systems. After my presentation, I was approached by a young developer who looked nervous, uncertain, familiar in a way I could not immediately place. He introduced himself, asked if we could talk privately, and then told me that he had been following my story for years. He said that he was currently experiencing something similar at his own company, that a senior colleague was systematically taking credit for his work, that he felt trapped and hopeless and unsure of what to do. He asked if I had any advice. I thought about everything I had been through, the pain, the patience, the years of careful work, the eventual justice. I thought about how alone I had felt during the worst of it, how desperately I had wished for someone to tell me that I was not crazy, that what was happening was real, that there was a path forward even when everything seemed impossible. I looked at this young developer, saw my former self in his anxious eyes, and knew exactly what I needed to say. I told him that what was happening to him was wrong. I told him that he was not imagining it, that his instincts were correct, that his work had value and deserved recognition. I told him to document everything, to be patient, to find allies who could corroborate his experiences. I told him that the path to justice might be long and difficult, but that it was possible, that he could prevail if he was smart and methodical and refused to give up. I told him that he was not alone, that there were others who had been through similar situations, that there was a community of survivors who would support him if he reached out. And then I gave him my contact information and told him to call me whenever he needed to talk. Because that is the real lesson I learned from everything I went through. It is not about revenge, not really. It is about solidarity. It is about making sure that no one has to face this kind of betrayal and isolation. It is about building networks of support that make it harder for predators to operate, harder for them to isolate their victims, harder for them to maintain the illusion of power that allows them to continue their schemes. Derek Holloway is out of prison now. I hear occasional rumors about his attempts to rebuild his life, to start over in some new industry where his history is less well known. Maybe he will succeed. Maybe he will convince some unsuspecting person to give him another chance. Or maybe the record of his actions will follow him forever, a permanent consequence of his choices, a warning to anyone who might otherwise become his next victim. I do not spend much time thinking about him anymore. He took years of my life, stole work that represented my best thinking, tried to destroy my reputation and my career. But in the end, he failed. I am still here, still building, still creating, still trusting the right people with my ideas and my effort. The betrayal he inflicted on me was profound, but it was not the end of my story. It was just a chapter, a dark and painful chapter, but one that led to other chapters. Better ones, chapters I am still writing every day. If you are going through something similar, if you have been betrayed by someone you trusted, if your work has been stolen or your reputation has been damaged by someone who does not deserve the trust you gave them, I want you to know something. You will get through this. It will take time. It will require patience and strategy and moments of doubt that feel overwhelming. But you are stronger than you know. The truth is on your side. And there are people out there, people like me, who understand what you are going through and who will stand with you when you need support. That is my story. That is the full account of what Derek Holloway did to me and what I did in response. I have told it as honestly as I can, without hiding the moments when I felt weak or uncertain, without pretending that revenge was easy or uncomplicated. I hope that it helps someone. I hope that it serves as both a warning and an encouragement. A warning that there are people in this world who will exploit your trust for their own advancement. And an encouragement that justice is possible, that truth has a way of emerging, that those who betray others will eventually face the consequences of their actions. Thank you for listening. Thank you for giving me the space to tell my story. And if you are out there fighting your own battle against someone who has wronged you, know this: you are not alone. You will never be alone. And one day, perhaps sooner than you think, the truth will come out. It always does.